Hi class. We're going to take a moment and look into some depth at the U-curve model of adaptation. This is one of my personal favorites in terms of intercultural communication models because it's so relatable. It really captures kind of the psychological experience of being a tourist or being a migrant in a really simplistic and relatable way. And the U-curve looks something like this. And what it is it's a model of psychological phases. So it has to do with the ways in which one's mind kind of changes and one's emotional journey shifts when you visit or relocate to a new place for, any sort of substantial period of time, whether you're going somewhere on an exchange program or whether you're going somewhere for, a summer trip or whether you're moving to a new place. We tend to see this U-shaped pattern of adjustment happen. So notice that the U starts off at a high point, and we call this the honeymoon phase. And in this honeymoon phase is where people will often experience a very positive, emotional kind of high. They have some excitement about their, new adventure that's ahead of them. They may be even idealizing or romanticizing the new place. They may have seen images of it or heard wonderful things about it. I remember one time telling my mother after a trip to Italy, I remember saying to her, "It's like a fairy tale there." So then when she took that trip, she went in with that expectation that it was a fairy tale. And when she got there, she encountered some challenges because if any of you have been to Italy, it's also can be also a very chaotic place. And especially if you don't know the language, you can struggle. So she started off on this high expectation and then kind of found herself kind of dipped down into a lower psychological state. And the honeymoon phase can do that to you, or the high expectations can do that to you. So any kind of fascination or idealizing of the new culture, the new country, can put you, can set you up for a little bit of a fall. But think about the last time you went on a trip. You packed your bags, you got on the plane, and you felt this excitement, and maybe even when you arrived, you felt some romanticism about the new location, the buildings, the streets. You were noticing the way people dressed, you were noticing the pace of life, and there was a kind of a phase of excitement and idealism that went on. But then what happens is the reality of being a human being and living kind of sets in, and then we see that people will sometimes encounter negative experiences, and they'll start to drop down and head down the U here. These negative experiences might include fatigue, just being tired, traveling, moving, relocating. It's difficult. And you can't take anything for granted. You have to be very watchful, and you've got to be making decisions all the time. You may have difficulty communicating if you haven't acquired the language. One may encounter some prejudices, or some stereotyping, some belligerence from residents of the location, or maybe you just make mistakes. You encounter that you don't do everything quite right, and you have some challenges that you face. So this creates this downward drop into the bottom of the U, which we call the crisis phase. This is also referred to as culture shock. And it is a psychological low point. It's where we see a person drop down and have a sense of disorientation, a sense of frustration. They also often feel helpless. Sometimes they feel a sense of longing, deep longing to go back, longing for home, longing for what is familiar, wondering if they should have ever come here in the first place. In its worst case scenario, one might experience an identity crisis. This probably wouldn't be true for a tourist, but it might be true for a migrant who is moving somewhere for the long term. And so they may start to question who they are and where they belong and things like that. Then predictably, we see a recovery phase. And this recovery phase is where people adjust. People do tend to adjust. It's quite predictable that they will adjust. Peace of mind can return slowly. Effectiveness starts to take hold again. People start to find a place, you know, socially, or they start to kind of find a groove. They find, like, even just from a spatial point of view, they might find their favorite place to go and get coffee in the morning in the new place, or they might find an ally or a friend that they connect with. They start to get a little bit more facility with the language. They start to kind of figure out the lay of the land, and things start to get a little easier, and people find themselves adjusting. And this adjustment often includes a sense of enjoyment as well. So we predictably see this U shape happen. Therefore, if you are going to travel or move, just know that you might experience a drop in your psychology. You might experience a drop in how you feel. You might notice you're having a little bit of a low at some point during your journey. And that is very, very normal. And you can also take comfort in the fact that you'll probably adjust. You'll probably buoy back up. We call this the stress adaptation growth cycle. And I want to call special attention to the word stress there. Normally we think of stress as a negative thing. Stress is something we try to avoid. We kind of demonize stress in our culture. And of course it is, you know, a kind of damaging response, and cortisol spikes during stress. However, stress is also associated with growth, with personal growth. So therefore, if we stay in our comfort zones, if we always do what is familiar, what is easy, and what is convenient, we will have a fine time, and we won't experience very much stress. But we will also stagnate in many ways personally. We won't grow as we would if we pushed ourselves into uncomfortable situations, if we took some risks, if we stepped out of our comfort zone a little bit more. So stress forces us into an adaptation state, and adaptation is associated with growth. Therefore, lean into things like fear sometimes, things like stress sometimes, and see what that situation may have to teach you about yourself and what is possible with your own growth and boundaries. These are some extreme symptoms of culture shock I'm about to share with you. You don't have to memorize these or anything like that, but it's just kind of interesting how it can show up. The mind can play funny tricks on a person when they are at that low point or when they're stressed. Remember, culture shock is also what we call the crisis point, the bottom of the U. Sometimes people notice they're angry, not just reasonably angry, but overly angry about minor things. So big anger over small things. They may have excessive fears about being cheated or robbed or injured, and they get very, very careful and cautious or paranoid. We may even see that they get this paranoia about drinking water and about the food and the bedding, and they want to make sure that there are no risks being taken. A feeling of helplessness, and the need to rely on other people heavily. Maybe a refusal to learn a language, or refusal to kind of step into the customs, the speaking patterns of the new place, depending on others of one's own nationality. So tourists may relate to this. Sometimes tourists who haven't done a lot of travel, they will look for, so an American tourist, for example, might look for the other Americans in the context and want to make contact with those people to create a greater sense of comfort and ease. A terrible longing, notice the word terrible there, really longing for what's familiar. Sometimes people can get a little bit turned inward, get sort of introverted at this state. Again, these are the more extremes. Having great concern over minor pains or ailments. Maybe you kind of blow something up, you become a little more hypochondriatic than you would in your normal state when you're in stasis. Excessive hand washing. So think about this question: how can we minimize culture shock? And the nice thing about seeing these kind of extremes, these extreme symptoms, is knowing that if you're experiencing any of these, it's probably your mind playing tricks on you a little bit. And I remember having an experience like this as a tourist once when I was a student. I had something that was sort of gnawing away at me. I had a fear that was getting the best of me. And the friend that I was traveling with sat me down. It was related to my own health. I started to kind of panic about something. And she sat me down and she kind of talked me down from the ledge, as we say. And so, you know, you can minimize culture shock by having an ally, a friend you trust, you know, interacting with people and just remaining open and not getting too uptight about these types of things. Here's the you applied to a student traveling to a foreign country for a study abroad. And in this example, the student is traveling to Australia. Notice the top of the U, they're leaving home. They're the farewells, which are sad, but there's also a happiness and there's an excitement. You know, there's the excitement of being a student on exchange, going somewhere new, the big adventure. And upon arrival in Australia, there are some hard times, right? There's some confusion, there's, you know, one is tired, but overall things are still okay. You know, you're still on a higher point, you're just tired. But then culture shock starts to set in. The student becomes lonely, starts to miss their family. They don't like the food maybe, or they don't quite know what to order, you know, and then of course you've got to study and the culture is unfamiliar to you. Maybe the people aren't quite what you expected. Who knows? And this leads to that low point of feeling unhappy. Notice these questions. Was I right to come here to Australia? Will I achieve my goal? Should I turn around and go home, right? Should I ditch this entire effort? You know, this was all a big mistake. Who am I? Where do I belong? These questions, critical questions, sometimes a bit of a crisis. But then we find there's an adjustment happening. Notice we see here that new friends and activities are key. New friends and activities, getting involved, finding one's footing, gaining some confidence, and finally completing the studies. Now, what do you think happens up here at the end of the study abroad? Well, you're back on a high point. You're back at a high emotional point where you feel happy. You may think, wow, you know, this was the best time of my life. And you may even think, I really love this place. And then you return home and guess what? There's another drop down and you miss the place that you just came from. You miss the host culture. You miss the place you visited. You miss the place you moved to that you originally had some difficulty with. So it happens. Sometimes they refer to this as the vacation blues. And this is the drop right here. It's where you're back home and you also drop down. You sort of get into a state of depression, the blues. You know, you wish you could go back. You wish you could go back to the host culture. So we're going to see this more often for a short-term sojourner, for somebody who's probably a tourist. Although I have seen that happen have heard about that happening to people who had moved, for example, to the U.S. I had a student who moved to the U.S. and she said when she went back to her home country, you know, she thought she would be so happy to return. And she was at first, but then she did experience a drop. And she felt like she had lost some of her belonging to her original home culture. And she was surprised by that. But of course, there's a recovery again when one is back home. We just call that the W curve. It just means that the U happens twice. Let's look at some skills for effective adaptation. First of all, let's talk about uncertainty. You know, whenever you enter a new place, a new situation, a new relationship, whatever, there are a lot of questions. We don't know how it's going to go. We don't know who we are within that context. We have a lot of uncertainty. And when human beings have uncertainty, they experience a spike in their anxiety. Anxiety goes up. Anxiety is an emotional response. It's chemical as well. And when you have anxiety, you become less effective. You become less effective in your interactions with other people. Your attitudes can become rigid. Your fears can escalate. So uncertainty can really work against intercultural communication, and it's very important to manage that anxiety. We want to get our anxiety to an optimal level. We don't want to reduce our anxiety so that it's non-existent. We just want it to be sort of in check. So if you have zero anxiety, you're also going to be ineffective because you will, for example, say things that are rude or stereotype people or blurt out things that you shouldn't say. So zero anxiety is not useful. We need to have a functioning level of anxiety to be social creatures. However, too much anxiety works against us and is dysfunctional. So we want to keep it at the functional level. How do we do that? Keep developing your self-esteem, have a solid sense of self, learn to become flexible, stay open in your attitudes and your behaviors. That doesn't mean you become spineless, it just means you're adaptable, you remain open, and you know, the environment plays a big role too. If you can find yourself in an environment where there's a welcoming attitude, where people are supportive, that can also help. You might have to look for those things. Be willing to take risks. Be willing to take risks. Listen, anytime we step out of our comfort zone, there's a feeling of risk involved there. You know, there's possible losses, but there's also possible gains. So, you know, no risk, no reward. We must risk, otherwise we remain stagnant. So a risk might be, for example, trying out the language, even though I'm scared that my pronunciation might sound stupid. Or a risk would be, I'm going to get on this train and go to location B, even though I'm not quite sure if that's the right thing to do, and I don't know anybody at location B. So people often go into fight or flight, and when we're talking about communication, fight means they get very assertive. They might just jump in, throw caution to the wind, and try out new things. Some people tackle risk like that. They just tackle it head on, and they take big risks, and they don't really think about it. A lot of us have a flight approach to risk, which means we hang back before we plunge in, and we are cautious. We are cautious. And both of these have their disadvantages. A more ideal approach might be what we call a flex approach. This is a combination of being assertive, but also being cautious, having a balance of both. So we have a readiness, a willingness, and an ability to be present and to step into new situations and kind of go with the flow. We call that the flex approach to interaction and to unfamiliar situations. Regular interaction. So it's important to keep talking to other human beings, to stay social. You may have noticed with some elderly people, when people isolate themselves, when they get, you know, lonely and they stop interacting with the world, they can get a little bit antisocial. They can get a little bit odd, and they stop becoming, you know, sort of like full functioning members of the social world. Okay, so don't isolate yourself. When you're in a situation where you need to adapt, stay in communication with other people, talk to other people, show up to social events, say yes to invitations, keep yourself a member of the world. Don't isolate yourself in your apartment or in your hotel room with your social media and your Netflix. You know what I mean? Keep in regular interaction with other people. It's very helpful for adaptation. And finally, find a hybrid space. Find hybrid spaces where you can experience your home culture to some degree. Find your favorite coffee shop that serves the thing from home that you love. Find a group that you can join and belong to and engage in culture familiar activities and communication. Find a place where your native tongue is spoken. Find a place where the food is, you know, reminds you of home. These are ways in which you can balance out your sense of stress and still allow yourself the personal growth associated with necessary adjustments. So that's the U-curve model. I hope this was helpful for you.